It's pretty rare that you can remember the time, place, and exact events of meeting one of your lifelong friends. But in 1981, by a wall in the Green Hills of Glenham community in East Fishkill, New York, I ran into Chris Orcutt. We were both 11, and we've been friends ever since. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other Patreon supporters who are contributing to this podcast and helping me get out of debt. When I met Chris in 1981, my parents had been divorced for a couple years, and I had moved to Green Hills of Glenham, not really enjoying life all that much. Everything was different and new and weird, but I made a go of it, and at Fishkill Elementary School in 4th grade, I was trying to adapt as best I could. A lot of this involved reading. I was a voracious reader, hundreds of books in a year. And among the other classmates were a smattering of kids who the school could call gifted, but just really meant that we cared about things like books and learning. And among them was Chris Orcutt. Chris had come from Maine and had moved numerous times before he was in Green Hills of Glenham. And when you try to look back at whatever the formula is that forms a friendship, whatever puts you together, sometimes it's just proximity. You have a desk next to each other, or maybe you're in the same project and you find something deep there, or maybe you're even the friend of the brother of someone who you end up really hitting it off with the other members of the family even more, and they become your primary friend. And when the proximity ends, when you're no longer in the same school or the same job or the same town, and yet you still seek each other out, that's a friendship that's got something else to it. I've had a number that have lasted over the years, but none as long as Chris. When Chris and I were both 11, we both loved learning about new subjects or engaging in all sorts of fiction and fantasy. We liked pop music. We enjoyed going around the neighborhood and playing and just being kids in a standard non-technology sense. We played a few video games here and there, whatever arcade machines were within walking distance, but we didn't have any ability to travel all around the world through a network. I had moved once or twice by the time I got into Fishkill Elementary, but Chris had moved many, many times. His parents were essentially nomads. They were more than happy to go from apartment to apartment to apartment, and it had an effect on Chris. He was very active in getting to know people because he didn't know how long he'd be there. And it affected how Chris did things. He was very energetic. It was infectious when you interacted with him. He made up words. He came up with stories. He turned any activity into an adventure. And his obsessions were legendary. At one point, he got into fishing, and you could not pull anything but fishing knowledge out of him. He knew all about the different lures you could use. He had strong opinions on those lures, and he knew where all the good fishing rivers were within walking distance. He didn't just like James Bond. He got incredibly into James Bond. He knew all of the trivia about the books, about the life of the author, Ian Fleming. He didn't go halfway. We didn't see some movies. We saw a lot of movies. When he came up with words to describe things or invented lingo, his talent at this was incredible. He would come up with a word and it would immediately be his. His capacity for lingo was so pronounced that I created a text file about Orcutt Talk, as I called it, where I listed all of the different things he was talking about and what the terms meant and what they were references for. Slang terms that suddenly we were all using because Chris was using them. In those early teen years, we drifted apart just out of physical necessity. I moved to Brewster, New York, and Chris moved to a different town, and it just wasn't possible to see him. But a couple years later, I bumped into Chris at the mall we had both shared, the Duchess Mall, where he was in a Boy Scout uniform and was demonstrating a computer. We had both fallen in love with computers. Chris characteristically with all of his passion and his thought. In my case, it was IBM PCs, and in Chris's case, it was TRS-80s and Tandy computers. This was partially because his father was the manager of a region of Radio Shack, and so they were getting really good deals on things like batteries and computers. Chris was demonstrating a Tandy computer there, and we struck up a conversation, and it was like no time had passed. He was so happy to see me, and we talked more on the phone. When you don't have a car, you have to get your parents to get you together. So through our late teens, Chris Orcutt and I would make an effort to see each other. We would talk on the phone, and we were able to call different bulletin board systems, and there was this love of computers that we shared. And it was during these teen years when Chris and I had now known each other for half a decade, and we were communicating with each other and could always share what was going on in our lives with each other and get advice that was meaningful. This is where our relationship to computers and technology starts to shift. I, of course, went whole hog into computers. They were my primary hobby, my main way of working with the world. I loved being online for most of the day, all of the night. I would collect everything I touched about them. I even collected the physical artifacts. It was a love affair that has never ended. For Chris, they became more of a utility. This wasn't Chris's interest. It was something he liked and something he had to use for school, but it wasn't a love affair. He appreciated what I loved, just like I appreciated all of Chris's hobbies, but we were absolutely going in different directions. In college, luck had it that we both went to the same city, Boston. He went to Northeastern, I went to Emerson College, and there we could see each other. And this is where I started to really worry about my friend, who I'd now known for nearly 10 years. Chris had begun drinking, and not just drinking, really drinking. He was drinking to the point that as I found out later, he was waking up in the lawns of dormitories that he was living at. He was losing time. He was smart. He was incredibly smart. So his grades weren't reflecting what was going on. And he had a talent, if you want to call it that, which showed itself, which made things even worse. When Chris drank, it didn't affect his speech center. Chris could sound to you like he was the most sober, straight-thinking person when he literally could not see you. Blind drunk. And a moment turned for me. I still remember this. On our second year together, when I and Chris were both moving into our dormitories, I came to visit him. And he was showing me the new digs he was moving into and how it was going to be awesome. And he showed me that he had packed 2 suitcases, and one suitcase had all of the clothes and all of the supplies he would need for his semester at college. And the other suitcase was nothing but alcohol. Bottles and cans and all sorts of drinks of every description. And I realized Chris was going to drink it all. And I couldn't believe he was going to spend an entire couple of semesters emptying this suitcase. And later, when I was talking to him, I found out that actually that suitcase didn't last a month. I at some point needed to make a decision, and the decision I made was that I figured my friend was going to die. And there was nothing I was going to be able to do about it. I couldn't be there to stop him from drinking. I couldn't be there to convince him otherwise. There weren't words that were going to come out of my mouth. So there's a recording that I have, and that recording is very precious to me. It's called Philosophy Chat. Chris was a philosophy student and had lots of ideas about the world and how things worked. And it was all towards a possible law or criminology degree. And I was working in the radio station of my school, in the AM station where, frankly, nobody cared what you did. So I loaded Chris in one day, invited him down, and he was, as usual, very drunk. And I sat him down in front of a microphone, and for about 4 or 5 hours, I talked with my friend about life. This recording goes in all sorts of directions, and it's an incredible amount of fun. It's two friends who have known each other for so long, just enjoying each other's company, going in every direction they want to, no holds barred. And in some ways, it's one of the best conversations we've had. But I recorded it because I assumed that Chris was going to die, that he was going to fall out of some window or stumble in front of a car or trip over some raised sidewalk or in some way be gone before he was in his 20s. And I'm so lucky that this never happened. But to have that artifact would have meant the world to me. Chris and I graduated, him with much better academic performance than me, and he moved back to New York while I stayed in Boston and took on a series of jobs, careers, marriage, life. Chris had met somebody in Boston. Her name is Alexis, and their marriage, I think, saved him. They cleaned up together. They got back on track. They became a couple that accomplished things. Chris became a corporate writer. He was writing copy for companies, and he was starting to write books, essays, novels, even a stint as a newspaper man. And this gave his life focus. It turned out that my friend had manic depression. It all kind of clicked into place when he was diagnosed. He had had these crashing lows where he had disappeared essentially for weeks on end, and he had this incredible energy at other times, and it was his brain going into these massive wave patterns across months. And with medication, it brought things back into focus. He didn't have to medicate himself with alcohol to be able to survive. And he and Alexis, like myself, rode the happiness of the dot-com boom, making pretty good cash, buying things here, buying things there, just having a good time. And things changed for Chris once again at his New York City job when he heard a terrible sound, looked out the window of his Merrill Lynch office, and saw that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center across the street. He got to watch bodies fall. He got to watch fire and terror, and he made his way out of the city to find that these buildings had fallen. This was very personal, very quickly. He and his wife moved out of the New York City area. They moved north to a town called Millbrook, New York, many, many miles away from New York City. And she had gotten a job with the local university, and she did a thing which still astounds me in its love and support. Chris decided that he wanted to be a writer full-time, full stop. Not something he did on the weekends, not something he did when he could grab time, but every single day become a writer, become a better writer, write things and rewrite them and hone them and publish them, create truly great books. He felt it had been what he had wanted all of his life. Chris started writing every single day, getting up early in the morning and focused and writing out hours and hours of text, just anything, or part of a scene he was writing, just getting it all on paper while his wife worked full-time to support him. His writing style, and by that I mean how he writes, is rather interesting and amazing. He doesn't use computers. He uses a pencil. He writes in long form on pieces of paper with a pencil for hours, not letting himself get pulled into distractions or stories or looking things up. He writes them out as one might do a letter so that every word has meaning. Among these novels are a series called the Dakota Stevens mystery novels. They're the story of an ex-FBI agent and his Eastern European partner who solve crimes and often stumble onto worldwide conspiracies and criminal organizations. And it's written with such skill, such wonder. In fact, we have kind of a deal, which is that I don't read the drafts. Normally, a really good friend would read your in-progress works, but I don't. I read the finalized work because I want to enjoy it as much as the rest of the world. Chris does so many drafts. He crafts these books. And throughout the years, our different lives with computers have come into sharp focus when it comes to talking about what this online world means to a true novelist. Chris's relationships to computers and mine are so black and white. You just can't believe we once were almost exactly the same about them. Chris has a Macintosh, a really nice high-end Macintosh that he uses on the weekends. He gives the social media passwords to his wife after making them random 32-character passwords, so he doesn't get to use social media during the week. He only goes on one day, and on that day he answers questions or deals with emails or reads up on what's going on online in a light way, but he quickly grows tired of it. That's not where he likes to live. The online world just doesn't hold any flavor for him. However, for me, it's everywhere I live. I browse hundreds of things a day. I read so many different stories. I'll go down rabbit holes of such depth I can't remember where I started. And occasionally we'll have these conversations that are pretty funny where Chris will say, "Hey, what's happened in the last couple of months?" And I'll say, "Well, here's a couple music videos you missed, and here's a project that looks pretty good, and I've been kind of involved in this or that. Take a look." And he'll glance over it, and he'll appreciate it in the same way that one might appreciate a garden. You know, somebody worked really hard on the garden, and the garden represents hundreds of hours in it, but they'll glance over it and say, "Yeah, nice garden." We have a tradition every year. I have a couple video game systems that I keep for him in a plastic bin, and he'll be between two books and need to chill out for a couple weeks, and he'll borrow this video game system, which is years out of date, but which has some games he likes, and I will give it to him. He will install it. He'll play it obsessively for a week or two, and then he'll give me a call and say, "Dude, come back here and get the tub. I don't need it anymore." What different worlds we live in, and yet we're still such close friends. Why am I talking about this? Well, it's because I feel like people have all different kinds of friendships out there. And there are lives that drift apart and come together. And through over 30 years of knowing each other, Chris Orcutt and I have been there. We've been what friends are. And as we get into our 50s, I think Chris Orcutt and I will continue to live these very different, yet intertwined and really meaningful days. This has been Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to Sam Johnston, James Bekoyanu, Adam Green, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon who have really helped me start to get myself out of debt. Chris is doing just fine. He is involved always in writing new novels and projects, and it's been an adventure working with him online as he has negotiated having a website or an Amazon page and making sure that his books all render properly in Kindle and all the other projects out there. So, he's got books out there if you want to check them out. His last name is spelled Orcutt. It's the Dakota Stevens Mysteries. I guarantee if you love noir, you will love these. The books are not just light stories of action and fighting, but there are thoughts about philosophy and relationships and what people are about. Chris loves words. He loves the interactions of people. He's got an incredible talent, by the way, that I've never seen from anybody else. He loves to learn names. He will learn people's names. I mean, the names of everyone who works at every shift of every store in his town. There were times that we'd be on a train together, and I'd go off and do something, and when the conductor came by again, he would say, "Hey, Jimmy, when are we going to arrive?" And it's a fearlessness in interacting with folks that computery me just doesn't quite have in the same amount. Chris, for his own part, has said he never can get over how I'm able to ingest so much information in a given day and come out sane and alive. He thinks it's a bizarre Iron Man tournament to be able to go on the web now. So when he sees me having 14 windows open and they're all this massive cacophony of video and muted sound, and he just says, "Okay, just let me know what's good, man. I don't need to learn this." How lucky we've been that we've had each other for this many years in so many different ways, and the sky's the limit.